All right, y'all. So today on A Beer and a Thought with Dr. Rip, we have Dr. Joe Ricotta. He graduated from Ithaca College in 2017 with his doctorate in physical therapy. He completed an orthopedic clinical residency at Hugo Medical Center, and now he is at Penn State getting his PhD. I will let him get into a little bit more of that, and I'll hand it off to you, Joe.
Hey, thanks, Jonathan, and thanks for inviting me. And wow, I'm excited to talk to you. We just finished up a meeting at Penn State's Action Club, which is Penn State's weekly or typically bi-weekly meeting that invites researchers from neuroscientists and from motor control in particular in to basically argue about what motor control means. So, you know, if the idea is for you and I to unpack some ideas that I find important, perhaps the most important one that we should start with is, you know, what is the concept of motor control? You see, we use the word in physical therapy all the time, right?
Yes.
Motor control. We train motor control, this motor control exercise. There is such a thing as a controlled movement and an uncontrolled movement, right? But we don't have explicit, or perhaps, you know, it's hard to come up with an explicit definition for these terms. So I'm going to bounce the question back to you, Jonathan. What is motor control? And particularly to you, who is in a neurologic residency, what does motor control mean, and how do you use that on a daily basis?
I was kind of afraid you were going to ask this question. So motor control, at least currently, I feel like motor control is this very abstract definition of all of these different concepts and ideas and terms that we do have a great understanding of, or at least a solid understanding of within the brain and how that impacts our ability to move. And motor control is kind of this poorly defined, like as a definitive definition, integration of all of that. So integrating our ability to turn muscles on and off, and integrating our ability to grade muscle contraction, integrating our ability to sequence muscle contraction. And then on top of all of that, use our body's feedback and systems and our sensory systems to further regulate and generate those movements. And I guess if I had to give it like a really simplistic definition right now, I would say it's pretty much any and every system you could think of that goes into movement, which is a kind of a cop-out because I feel like that's every system within the body. But maybe more so focusing on a neural connection standpoint and a neural processing standpoint.
Right. Yeah, those are great answers, and that's an exceptionally great answer for me, having just put you on the spot with a really difficult question. What is motor control? And the truth is, if you ask this question to most of the researchers that are in motor control right now, you're going to get wildly different answers, right? For example, we just watched a talk with a neuroscientist who studies out of Marquette, who mentioned the word, I don't know if you heard, and to the listeners, you certainly didn't hear, unless you were there, of course, but you heard the word internal model, right? The word internal model is very hotly debated. Well, the words internal model are very hotly debated words in the field of motor control, and maybe we can get into that in a bit. But also what you might hear are things such as movement stability, or these strange concepts like this weird combination of words, the uncontrolled manifold, right? You hear words like synergies, particularly in a neuro rehab context. You hear the word synergy, and we think of particular patterns of muscle activation that occur when there's some dysfunction in some part of the brain, right? Typically from some neurovascular injury or serious brainstem injury, right? So you mentioned sensory information. Somehow that fits in there too, right? The body is not just a doing thing, it's a feeling thing. And a really big hurdle that the field of motor control tries to approach or tries to overcome is the merger or the integration of action and perception, right? Here's another field of debate within neuroscience in particular and in motor control. Are action and perception different things? If we look at the way that the nervous system operates, we see action potentials in one direction, we see action potentials in the other. The sodium ions seem to be pretty much the same in those neurons when they go one way or the other, right? Yet one produces movement and the other produces the perception of movement, right? So it's a question of definition. Another piece of the puzzle, another debate topic that's in motor control right now is, what is the difference between motor control, motor neuroscience, motor planning, cognitive neuroscience, right? So there's a lot of terms and there's a lot of muddy water in the academic fields, importantly for sure. And in the clinical fields, there's some interesting questions too, right? So clinically, what does it mean to describe somebody's movement, right? Let me give some examples. So Paul Hodges as a motor control researcher out of Australia, right, has done a lot of work with pain and movement, right? I'm thinking of one study in particular. He used some EMG electrodes to detect the activity of motor units inside the quadriceps. He had people push against a force sensor, and they calculated how much force they produced. They kept it at 20 newtons or something like that, and then they watched how the motor units organized themselves in order to produce that force, right? And then they did what Paul Hodges likes to do. He made their subjects hurt. I think he injected subpatellar saline, or it was suprapatellar saline, subpatellar saline. They injected saline into the knee, and it produced pain with patellar contraction. Then they did the same thing again. They hooked these subjects up to a machine. They recorded the motor units, and they had them kick into a sensor. They produced 20 newtons, and they saw if there was any difference in the way that motor units fire, right? And the answer is yes, motor units fire differently in the context of pain, right? Okay, the question is, so what? What does that mean clinically? How do you take findings like that from research in motor control and interpret that in a way that's clinically useful, right? Moreover, if I can take even another step forward in this long rant, what is a movement system, right? Out of all of the past maybe say 6 different concepts or debate ideas that I just put forth, this one might be most clinically applicable for those listening. What is a movement system? What isn't a movement system, right? And how do we do things to predictably characterize and interact with the movement system? So you mentioned a name earlier, Beth Fisher, and that seems like it's a name I'm not familiar with, honestly. And you mentioned this in a context of learning about movement and how you diagnose movement, characterize movement, things like that, in a neuro rehab context, right? What does Beth Fisher study? Is that the name that you would typically associate with movement in a clinical context for neuro, Jonathan?
So when I think of her name, I generally think of kind of looking at some of the literature behind neuroplasticity and motor control, kind of following stroke. I'd say right now, I think more so of our clinical residency director, Susan Ryerson, who kind of leads our movement session. So each week or bi-weekly, kind of depending on the schedule, we'll have a movement session, and she'll kind of give us her clinical experience and expertise and understanding of movement systems. And she's written a couple of books on movement analysis and movement systems and kind of understanding movements in patients post-stroke. And but I kind of want to go back to something you said in terms of clinically looking at motor control, because it made me think of a patient I had this past week. So they had a basal ganglia corona radiata infarct. And I think very neuroanatomically into their deficits and relating that to what I expect to see and kind of how I'm interpreting what I am seeing. And this particular patient, upon sensation testing, coordination testing, proprioception testing, strength testing was, I say strength testing, manual muscle testing, which we could have a whole other debate on if it's actually testing strength. Was fully functional strength, and on proprioception testing was fully intact bilaterally. And I've further come to learn that maybe our proprioception testing is not necessarily the most valid or reliable in terms of testing our actual ability to determine joint position in space. But in gait, she had no concept of knee position in space. And my mentor and I kind of ended up coming to and concluding was that it's more of a functional proprioceptive issue rather than a testing proprioceptive issue, regardless of the testing proprioception issue of whether or not we're actually testing that with our testing.
Right.
And I think when I think of motor control, kind of getting into all of the different things that you were mentioning and all of the different systems that are involved with it, I think that ambiguity within the neural connections within the brain and throughout the body, and you kind of mentioned not only the actual movement piece, but the sensation piece going back. I feel like that's a clinical piece of where I look at it and I say, that's a motor control issue. Mm-hmm. But then what does that mean doesn't necessarily follow suit.
Right.
But
right.
Just like a quick aside of kind of how like in the clinic in a neuro rehab setting, that's kind of where I feel like it's hard to draw those connections, at least for me personally.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Other clinicians might feel the same way.
Absolutely. Well, let's use that clinical case as an example. So I'm going to ask you a series of questions. Mm-hmm. The first question is the deficit that you saw so can you describe the knee issue a little more clearly? Is when she's ambulating, is she having difficulty flexing her knee or bearing weight on that side of the body? With a flexed knee, is it more of a hyperextension issue like you might see in stroke?
So it's a little bit of both.
Okay. Like
if you say I want you to squat down and bend your knee, she can bend it. It mm-hmm. might not be controlled. It might not be to an amplitude that you were hoping. And then when you say straighten it, she might straighten it and it'd be, with a slight bend in it, or it might be back into hyperextension. And with each weight acceptance into stance, it changed. Every step it was different. And part of that might have been she hadn't walked enough after diagnosis to be able to generate an effective compensatory strategy. But with gait training and with some what I would call motor control training, sure. Kind of bedside and standing, there was improvement that was able to be seen. But mm-hmm. When I was trying to think what I was seeing clinically back to the neuroanatomy, and of course the neuroanatomy of the coronary rod is it's harder to definitively say based on imaging.
Sure.
What tracts were impacted.
Well, the basal ganglia is interesting in general because even a small lesion, like in Parkinson's disease, the lesion itself is very small in the substantia nigra, but the clinical results of that lesion are, it's wild to think that such a small surface area of neurons can impact movement in such an incredibly strong way, right? But in this particular instance, you're mentioning that she was able to improve some features of her movement, right? With training, specifically oriented towards a functional deficit, right? Mm-hmm. And then we used the word functional motor control deficit earlier, right? So I'm going to pin you back even harder here. What is functional? What is a functional motor control deficit as opposed to a non-functional motor control deficit, right? Because there's something here that I think is really interesting for me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So not really having thought of that term or even concept until 2 or 3 days ago. And it's been something that hasn't necessarily sat well with me, just because it's like a poor answer. I think it kind of, so we can look at lesions and say, okay, that impacted the cerebellum, so we're going to expect to see this deficit. But I feel like a more functional motor control issue almost makes me think back to almost like a hypofunction type of case with the vestibular, not in the sense of presentation, but in the sense of it's the central processing that we can change, and we need to kind of restructure and get to understand this new level of normal. And with a functional deficit, it might not be something that we can directly correlate to a specific neuroanatomical location or a neurophysiological lesion, or that we can say, this system and this tract is definitively impaired.
Right.
But more so that the central processing and the extensive connections between the different portions of the neural system are not capable of performing the activity that's being asked, or the demand that's being asked. Because like for this particular patient, you look at a 5-time CT scan and they were just outside of fall risk cutoff. But then you have them ambulate and the whole thing goes to heck. And if they had a more of a, what I would say, non-functional motor control deficit, something that is very lesion specific to any activity within that requires, that activity is going to be limited, whereas functional might be that specific activity that you're asking them to do is impaired because the processing that's required for that functional task in particular is impaired.
Right.
Maybe there's like 2 or 3 different definitions in there, but
yeah, well, I guess what I'm trying to point out, and the really important point here is that it's very hard, and it's not impossible, but it's very difficult to give a straightforward definition for many of the terms that are oftentimes used clinically around motor control in human movement, right? And the difficulties that you're saying you're having in defining something like a functional movement issue versus a non-functional movement issue are the same difficulties I face as a researcher, right? Because these terms are used clinically, and we know they exist. We know there's something that's called a functional movement problem, and we know it's different than a non-functional movement problem. But the moment that I envision it as like a cloud or fog on the ground. We know there's a cloud up there, but when we're in the airplane and we approach it, the closer we get, the more it appears to be less of a solid structural substance, but more of an ethereal. You can't grab it. You can't grab cloud, right? So the closer you look at it, the harder it is to define it, and the harder it is to get a grasp on it, right? And that's, I think that particularly for a profession that professes expertise in movement and in the movement system, right? That's a problem. And I sent over, and for those listening, there's a preprint from Shirley Sarman in PTJ. As of right now, it's a preprint, just a manuscript that's on there. And Shirley Sarman identifies this issue with, some appropriate vigor, that we are largely in lack of a diagnostic system, or a system of, really what she's saying is we lack the words to accurately describe, and consistently describe across practitioners the movement system, a normative account of the movement system, what's normal, in other words, and when that differs, right? Now, it is not the case that we do not say that there's such a thing as movement problems, right? Or that there is not such a thing as normal movement. Of course, we know that you can have normal variability in movement, right? But when it comes to movement problems, well, yeah, we can see it, right? For example, when you watch so I'm trained in orthopedics, so I'm going to use an example with an ACL tear, right? Or potentially a soccer player, 17-year-old female soccer player who is the most likely population to sustain an ACL tear, to my knowledge, from the evidence. You can watch them jump off a box and descend and try to control their descent, and you will see dynamic valgus in the knees, right? Now, we're seeing more of a division now in the schools of thought, but you will see two camps. One camp says that's a movement problem that needs to be fixed. We need to control that by training, gluteus medius is the typical one, the clamshell repertoire. Or the other one says, and this is driven largely by Greg Lehman's work, right? Movement optimism. Well, valgus is just a normal response to load based on the biomechanical factors that are at play, plus the strength of quadricep muscles and hip muscles. And by the way, movement variability is good. We should train people to move well and move often, not so much to move, in a very predetermined way, right? So we know that there's a distinction, and we all have this intuitive distinction between what good movement is and bad movement is. But what Shirley Sarman pointed out in that article is that there is a divide between practitioners, particularly in the ortho world, to my knowledge, that it causes some issues in the profession, right? Causes some issues in the profession. And so largely one of the really interesting problems that I am focused on, and the reason I'm asking you all these impossible questions and raising my own impossible questions is the following. We lack the language, we lack the concept to accurately describe human movement clinically that is reproducible, that is physiologically accurate across all movements, right? And that has a one-to-one mapping to nervous system function, right, across all individuals, of all demographics, and perhaps even across species, right? Because there is this small subset of physical therapists that works with horses and other animals. I know very little about it, but as a general principle, we should expect, the way that humans move to bear some similarity to the way that other animals move, right? Right. And so there's actually really interesting work. There's really interesting series of papers and even books written by this old Russian guy named Nikolay Bernstein, right? Now, Nikolay Bernstein he's largely considered the father of motor control in my field of motor control, if I can call it my field. And he was alive around the time of Ivan Pavlov, who was also Russian, right? And I'm saying Russian, at the time it was the Soviet Union, so these are Soviet scientists, right? And Nikolay was in a school that was contraposed to Ivan Pavlov very strongly. And Bernstein wrote a book called On the Coordination and Regulation of Movements, right? In which he tried to answer the exact questions I'm posing to you. What is movement? Where does it come from? How can we classify movement? And his work is largely an exercise in trying to do exactly that, right? Now, there's actually just a translation published this year, but it didn't really see the light of day in Russia either for a long time, because Ivan Pavlov had passed away the year that Nikolay Bernstein wanted to publish. And out of respect for Ivan Pavlov, Bernstein didn't publish the book because it's just rude. You need to give time in order to honor the man's life before you publish a book that openly criticizes his ideas, right? That seems fair. And Bernstein was a pretty harsh critic of Pavlov's work. Now, Pavlov worked mostly with operant conditioning And, you might even be more familiar with Pavlov's work than I am, as somebody who has a background in sports psych, right? Conditioning schemes that largely came from Pavlov's work. But there was a sort of atomism that was, or by atomism, I mean, Pavlov largely viewed the brain as an input-output system, right? Mm-hmm. That might sound okay to a lot of people, right? The brain is an input-output system, but there are some difficulties with that view. And Bernstein highlights some of those difficulties, right, in his work. But Pavlov used this system of thinking in order to construct a very practical and very still today useful theory of behavior, right? And how behavior changes in animals and how behavior changes in humans, mm-hmm. which largely may have had neurophysiological mechanisms behind it misconstrued. Mm-hmm. So that's Pavlov and his relationship to Bernstein. But Bernstein wrote this book around that time. It wasn't published for this reason. Pavlov had just passed away. Out of respect for Pavlov, it waited a few years, 5-6 years. It was published, and it didn't really receive a ton of press in Russia, right? But in this book, Bernstein covers what are called levels of movement, right? So he's trying to construct movement from the ground up, literally. And his levels, he was a really creative guy, get this. His levels were named level A, level B, you get it. He goes all the way up to level E, right? And at each level, he tries to build, the very foundations of movement from things like oscillatory movements at level A, basic movements that you might even see in other creatures, such as, say, helminths. Bernstein largely thought that postural muscles operated in the same way that worms move their bodies, right? Mm-hmm. Which, by the way, he was largely wrong. Right? A lot of his work needs to update, right? But then, we go from level A up to level B, which is the level of synergy, right? And that's another word that I had used earlier. And the level of synergy was, let me ask you, when you hear synergy as a neuro rehab professional, what do you think of?
I mean, my first thought kind of goes into, your flexion extension based synergies, kind of following the Brunster model. But I don't think I feel like I have a strong understanding of the neuroanatomical reasoning behind why they occur.
Yeah, sure. I don't think most scientists do either. So that's not unique to you. Of course, I'm speaking for all scientists. Maybe it's just you and me, John. But yeah, that's what comes to mind for me too. And there's alternative definitions, and clinically, it's oftentimes used for patterns of muscle activity that covary positively, which means that you see an increase in activity of one muscle at the same time as seeing an increase in activity of the other muscle, and they kind of occur at the same time, right? So I'm going to kind of turn that upside down, right? And I'm going to say this is what Bernstein said as well, that the level of synergies is mostly and primarily organized such as to stabilize performance in a way, right? Or in other words, to organize elemental variables, right, in order to stabilize some task. All right. Now that's level B. And then you have level C, which is the level of spatial reference. And then you have level D, which is more of a conceptual level. This is the first level, I think, that only emerges in humans. And then you have level E, which is purely abstract. And he gives the example of drawing a circle. And then he says, well, this movement can occur at any level. You can see circular movements in the tremor of Parkinson's disease, which is a very low level issue in the brain, right? And then you can see circular movements when you were trying to play a piano, which I think he relates to the level of synergies, right? You can see circular movements when you were trying to, draw an O on a piece of paper, or to draw a clock on the piece of paper, which largely relates to the level C. And then you have levels D and E, where you can draw an O on the paper, and that represents the number 0, and that's a numeral, right, which is very abstract, higher level. So the point is, you can see one movement and it can emerge from multiple different areas in the brain, right? And that was one of the interesting things that Bernstein had identified that Ivan Pavlov largely didn't, right? Movements can occur, the same movement can occur from activity in different brain parts, right? In fact, you can think of infinitely many ways that the brain can, quote unquote, activate in order to produce one individual movement, right? So that's kind of cool, I think. But the really cool part that I want to go back to is the level of synergy, because I think it provides a framework for us, or at least it starts to open up the door towards defining the movement system for me, right? So the level of synergy. What should we say about it? Well, should we talk about it? Is the question. The level of synergy is more or less defined by the capacity to coordinate movement, right? So I'm holding a wine glass in my hand, right? Which actually, unironically, is the same photo that's in front of the book that is titled Synergy by my advisor, Mark Latash. There's, I think, two hands holding a glass of wine, so it's a shame that you're not drinking wine right now, Jonathan. But,
I gotta be sorry.
Yeah, no sweat. So, how can I relate synergy to a simple activity such as holding the wine glass, right? Well, imagine that my 4 fingers, so to those listening who can't see, I'm holding the wine glass with a normal prehensile grip, right? I've got pad to pad on my 4 digits, index, middle ring, and little, and then pad grip with my thumb on the wide part of the wine glass, right? Now, we have to imagine that there's, such a thing as too strong a force to apply on the wine glass. There's such a thing as too little force, right? Too strong a force would cause the glass to break and for me to spill my wine, and that would be awfully unhappy for this Friday afternoon. Not enough force would also cause me to drop the wine glass, right? And again, this is thin glass, it would shatter and whatever. I don't have to describe why dropping a wine glass is bad news to everybody. But the idea is that there's a range within which, you should maintain your grip on the glass such that it doesn't fall or break, right? The interesting thing is, let me ask you, how many different force levels can I use between 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 fingers in order to satisfy that single requirement, right?
Yeah, I mean, an infinite number.
That's exactly it, right? It's an infinite number, right? So the question that I had, and I have a lot of questions, don't I? But the question I have for you, and the question that Bernstein asked in his book, which was the question he formulated in order to come up with the levels of movement. The question is, how does the brain pick which levels of force to use in a task like that, right? Let's take an even simpler task. Let's take, taking your index finger and touching your nose, right? Perfect. To those that aren't listening, Jonathan just followed my lead in doing so, right? There are how many different ways to go from your hand in your lap to your nose? Well, it's a rhetorical question. Sorry for asking. The answer is infinite, right? The answer is infinite. How does your brain pick from an infinite number of possible solutions to a movement problem? Right? Because there are, in fact, for basically every movement that means anything to the human body, there are a redundant number of ways to complete that movement, right? Think about something as simple as standing up from a chair. The number of starting positions that you can obtain, as well as, I'm going to talk physics for like a real fast second, right? The number of starting positions that you can obtain with, the angles of your joints in all 3 planes, the angular velocities of those joints, as well as the mass of your joints with your orientation to your center of gravity, right? Those all, right, are combined in such a way as to form an infinite number of possible solutions, possible number of starting places in order for you to stand up. And then when you begin to stand up, consider that you have to activate quite a few muscles, right? All of which have quite a few motor units, right? All of which have quite a few alpha motor neurons in the spinal cord that associate with them, all of which are, kind of traced back to the brain in some way or another if you're not, if you don't have some serious nervous injury. So the brain is the starting place, and the muscles are the quote unquote finish line, if I can use that word for this movement, right? It takes a lot of pencil and paper in order to model exactly what you think the brain would need to do in order to coordinate movement of the hip joint, knee joint, ankle joint, the torso, the spine, right? Even the shoulders and arms, head and neck, eye gaze, right? All of these things, which are responsible for getting somebody up and out of a chair, right? So even in something as simple as standing up, you have a redundancy problem. And that's the term that Bernstein used. And that's the term that kind of defined his work, right? Redundancy, movement redundancy. How does the brain solve the redundancy problem, right? So there's an intuition that I have about this problem, but, as a neurotherapist, John, how do you view the capacity for the human body to move in different ways? Let me ask you even more simply, is it good or bad that the human body can move in different ways?
I think it's fantastic.
Me too. I certainly do, right?
So yeah. I think, so part of the residency is we have this fall semester we're adjunct faculty within the PT program for one of their rehab courses, and then next summer as well. And I know something that I try to hit or try to hammer home with the students in lab sessions and some of the lecture sessions, and that I think I've never really verbalized this in a way that I'm about to, but I'm gonna give it a shot because I want to see what you have to say about it.
Sure. I
like to think that our nervous system, and we've kind of touched on this, we don't, as a human species, we do not have a super strong comprehensive understanding of our neural system. And I think that it functions in task accomplishment and task completion, because as much as it's 2020 and we're an advanced species and have all of these things, I always try to remember that our core is hunter-gatherers that used to at some point rely on our physical bodies for everything. And in terms of physical adaptations, our brains have kind of been the one thing that separates us. We can't fly away from prey. We're not fast enough to get away from a lot of prey. We're not strong enough to get away from some of the prey. Our bodies, at least now, are not meant to be outside in the elements and surviving days without food and taking down massive creatures all the time. And obviously back then our bodies have shifted now through evolution, but at our core, what separated us and allowed us to survive was our brain's ability to adapt to task accomplishment, and not even physical task accomplishment, but just learning in general. And I think that's what we're still trying to figure out as a species, is how our brain is able to do that. And for birds, they can fly away from their prey. That's like their main thing. For grizzly bears, it's being bigger and stronger and able to eat their predators or whatever. But for humans, it's our ability to use our brain to use our environment to help us survive. And now that we don't have to do that, we're seeing a shift. And I think in terms of a PT perspective, a rehab perspective, I try to always remember that our brains are hardwired, and I use hardwired lightly because nothing's hardwired. It's very fluid. to accomplish tasks, and they don't think, like, we don't consciously think about sequencing or on off or
right
movement.
When we have to,
we just think about task accomplishment. And we know that, based on optimal theories of motor learning, when you give that external cue, that's putting an emphasis on that task accomplishment rather than in movement, that's putting an emphasis on that task accomplishment rather than an internal model. And I think that affords a necessary ambiguity within the brain that our brains are all our brain knows is standing up from that chair, at least that we can consciously comprehend. So it relies on our past experiences, and I have no data to back this up, but it probably even starts with movements in the womb, and it relies on all of the contextual factors and past experiences of movement, what it has done in the past to accomplish a task. And also, and I'm going to kind of steal from Lisa Feldman Barrett's emotional science type work here, and at least my understanding of it, and that with emotion, there's no footprint for any single emotion in the brain. People can experience what we would all define as fear or sadness, and their emotional footprint on the brain is going to be completely different. And I think with movement, it's no different, because our brain functions the same way. It doesn't function in I walk now, so X, Y, and Z happens. It functions in I walk and it's a bright day, so I'm squinting my eyes, which means I'm not relying on my visual system, so I'm using my vestibular and proprioceptive, but then I'm wearing big hiking boots, so I can't feel the ground, and it uses all of those external factors and combines them with our internal factors of I'm also digesting because I'm hiking and just ate and trying to at least get some digestion started, and now my heart rate's going up because I'm hiking again. And it takes all of that information, which I think for humans right now to conceptualize is an astronomical feat, and it makes it into a fluid movement. And I think that's why there isn't necessarily a specific, at least not to my knowledge, motor pattern for specific brain area activations, because it's easy for us to categorize and chunk things and say, well, this part of the brain does this, this part of the brain does this. When in reality, every part of the brain is active in nearly every part of any type of movement or concept of movement.
Absolutely.
And I think because of that, it's difficult. And one thing that I know I just, like, from a conceptual standpoint, struggle with is it's 2020. We can put people on the moon, but how do we not at least have kinematic or kinetic data to say, in a 50-year-old male of European descent, this is going to be their allostatic range for gait, and or any other type of demographic. And it's just because there hasn't been a study or an analysis that's looked at enough people to not only generate a kinetic or kinematic allostatic range,
mm-hmm.
but nobody's even thought about looking at, or at least not to my knowledge, nobody's really looked at that at the level of the brain under, like some type of imaging, which would be very difficult during a dynamic task like walking.
Right, yeah. MRIs don't tend to be very portable. EEGs can be, and EMGs, MEGs.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are fantastic thoughts. I love that you pointed out that it's all task related, and you actually brought up a bunch of different tasks, either advertently or inadvertently, like hiking and eating. One of those two is something I really enjoy. I won't tell you which. But it's all task oriented, right? Which, by the way, eating is a motor task, right? Speaking is a motor task. Keeping your eyes on a particular. We, for example, provide some form of privilege to language,
mm-hmm.
right? And in this talk we just watched, the individual who was speaking, gosh, I can't believe his name isn't coming immediately to mind. Up here. Rob Scheit. Rob Scheit out of Marquette. Fantastic researcher, fantastic talk, brilliant guy, very kind. Handles debate well, obviously, by the Action Club, how that went.
Yeah, he did. He did a good job.
Bob Scheit brought up, oh, geez, I just lost my train of thought, Jonathan. What were we?
They were looking at vibratory sensation for helping improving paretic limb coordination in motor control. I use that term loosely, motor control.
Yeah, that's fine. Use with caution.
Vibratory sensation they looked at mostly applying it to the non-paretic limb, which I found really interesting.
Yeah, it was a super interesting talk. There was oh gosh. You might want to jot down how far into the chat we are, so when you edit later, you don't have to listen to all this so that you can crop it. You can keep it if you want.
Yeah.
But there was something that he mentioned in the talk, which related to what we were just discussing, task related. There it is. So when Bob Scheit was discussing his research, all this is unpublished, so I'm going to cover it very quickly and very generally because it's in press and I don't want to, release breaking news before it's actually broken. He discussed a study where he asked people to report which of two stimuli was stronger, right? So he had, some vibrations on the arm, and then he said, okay, which of these two is a stronger vibration, right? And people said 1 or 2, right? Those are the only two options. It's 1 or 2. And he then followed that up with a series of studies that used the same vibration stimuli in order to help with, proprioceptive features of the paretic arm in stroke patients, right? So, well, at least the idea is to progress it to stroke patients. So he was working in a healthy population at first. I should clarify that, but the idea is to get it to a clinical population. What's interesting and something that's not often picked up, and a question I had and didn't ask, and I wish I did, is the following: how do measures, psychometric measures, such as which of these two vibrations is stronger, which of these two pitches is louder, which of these two colors is brighter, right? These measures that rely upon verbal report. How do these compare to measures that rely or are backed by human movement, right? And really why I ask that is because I believe that we privilege language in a way that is oftentimes or potentially harmful to our research. And I'm talking from a research perspective now. Mm-hmm. And perhaps, for those that read this kind of research, consider this when you're reading it. What is language? There's another hard question, right? Well, let me answer my own question. Language is a motor act. It's a speech act, right? Language is movement of the tongue and jaw and muscles within the throat as well. Hyoid bone. Don't get me to go into the anatomy of the neck right now, right? But it is a complex and coordinated motor act, which is governed by a region of the brain that is responsible for motor output, right? We know Broca's and Wernicke's area very well from patients with strokes in those regions. Patients with an infarct. So what are we really doing when we compare studies where people verbally report a sensation versus verbally act on it? Is it possible that there's such a thing as perceiving to act and perceiving to report? Neuroanatomically, it might be the case, right? If I have those same sensors, if I have vibration on my arm, right, and the sensors vibrate. Okay, there go my Pacini corpuscles, and they send signals up my dermatome into my brachial plexus, into my spinal cord, up to my brain, and then up to my sensory homunculus. I'm skipping a lot of parts, I know. And then I somehow magically feel it, and then I somehow, magically report what I feel, right? Well, we should probably look at what I mean by magically feel and magically report. If we look inside the brain, inside the skull in particular, you'll see signals travel to the sensory part of the cortex, right? The postcentral gyrus, which is where we typically attribute sensation to occur, right? And then that information has to go where in order for me to report it, right? Think about it. If I have vibration on my left arm and then it goes up, it travels up north into the brain, it finds my sensory homunculus. And does that information then have to cross the corpus callosum and then find its way into the left temporal lobe and left parietal lobe in order to interact with Broca's and Wernicke's area? Because if so, we should actually anticipate differences in reporting. And again, I'm ignoring the right side of the brain, which is also responsible for language to some degree, right? Left is definitely more involved than right. We know this, but
in a right-handed individual. Yeah.
Right. But shouldn't we expect there to be a difference in report for the same sensation given to the right arm? Consider that the distance and the number of neural circuits that are involved in the transmission of information from the skin of my right arm up my spinal cord, right, into my left sensory cortex now, right? And then to the language region of my brain. The transit time is less. The distance is less. There's less of a chance that the quote unquote signal will be interrupted by noise from somewhere else, right? So if we view speech as a motor output, we start to think about how non-intuitive results could emerge, right, from something as simple as using the same stimulus on the other side of the body, even in healthy controls, right? In fact, one of the researchers that was there, Dr. Sainberg from Penn State, he studies laterality in the brain, particularly in context with movement. He studies arm movement. He's actually doing a trial right now with virtual reality in rehab with folks with stroke. It's super cool work. But it's clear from his work that laterality matters. It's non-intuitive, and lesions in one part of the brain can affect the quote unquote involved arm in very obvious ways, right? And it can also involve the quote unquote uninvolved arm in non-obvious ways, right? So they're looking at some interactions there. But I'm going to back up. I'm going to back up for a second. Did you have something, Jonathan?
No, that's interesting. So I mentioned before we have Neuro Consortium talks that we listen to, and that's kind of where I've gotten to be introduced to Beth Fisher and some of the things that they talk about. And I can't remember the specific presenters. I'm sure some of this is coming from Dr. Fisher's lectures. But is looking at transcranial magnetic stimulation and kind of measuring aspects of activity, and then also inducing aspects of activity. And to your point of laterality, a lot of what they're finding is that sometimes even I might butcher the wording on this, a lesion to one side of the brain can actually the other side of the brain can start to shut that side down because it's not functioning as properly. Yes. I'm hoping I remember that correctly. And evolutionarily, I mean, it makes sense because our bodies are meant to get an injury and heal or adapt. And again, back to that task accomplishment. And I think it's important to remember that, kind of going back to some of the perception and no real definitive map of the brain. Like, yes, there's regions that are generally more responsible for things, but the context of which our bodies bring into our brains, I should say, not our bodies, the context our brains bring into every sensation and movement scenario is going to change the brain activation pattern. And even and that's impossible to control for within research subjects, unless you had a group of people that decided to devote their lives to research that all lived the exact same way.
Right. At the time of birth.
Yeah. And
I call those twins, Jonathan.
Yeah. And again, I'm still stealing that idea from some of Feldman Barrett's work, but just that And I think it's important to consider that those contextual factors, and I think when it comes to PT and physical therapy and applying this into the clinic and to kind of bring in some of the context from the last talk I had with Tim Reynolds into this one, is that patient, really understanding the patient and who they are and what their experiences are and what they experience things as and how they experience things is an essential aspect that we can bring into not only like just making the session a little more fun and interactive and things, but also to improving their ability to tap into their known motor control centers. And I use that lightly, their centers, because it's going to be tapping into their individual map. So, you know, you and I might have a better understanding of what tracks are involved and, you know, what the signals look like and where we expect to see, you know, activation or whatever. But their brain is the only one that knows what their specific activation pattern for that sit to stand or that gait is. And I think maybe that's more what I mean with like a functional motor control. I'm going to change the definition from earlier. And, you know, salience, that's like a big aspect of neuroplasticity, but I think salience, more so than the fact that it's meaningful to the patient, ties into that fact of it does a better job of allowing the brain to predict and perceive what it expects to happen and match that to the feedback that it gets to alter its own internal map of movement.
Yeah, so there are a few different levels of thought there, and that they're actually explicit levels. I want to cover those. It's not like I'm a lecturer or anything, but wow, I have this idea and I want to share it.
No, I'd love to hear it.
The levels, so this is actually, I'm stealing this from a philosopher, and I don't want to stay in philosophy land too long, but Daniel Dennett is a philosopher of mind, really bright guy. He talks about 3 different levels of description. One is the intentional level. The second is the designed level. And the third is the physical level. That's going from the top down, right? At the most complex, we have the intentional. At the most, quote unquote, simple, we have the physical, right? Let me give an example. The reason he brings these up is in order to describe how we talk about things and how we predict them in the future, right? So I'll tie this into the clinic at the end, I promise, right?
Yeah,
but to start, let's start with something really simple and mundane. Let's start with an alarm clock, right? What is an alarm clock? How do I predict how an alarm clock is going to function? There are 3 ways. The first way is for me to sit down with a pen and paper and to get my physics textbook and to look at the circuit board inside the alarm clock and track the particular motion of currents, right? And then how those currents flow through transistors, resistors, capacitors, all these functions that an alarm clock nowadays might have, right? Or back in the day, I look at how the spring inside the cogs would function in these really old clocks. By the way, it's not at all obvious how people before 1700 were able to make functioning clocks. Think about that for a second. That's crazy. Yeah. How did they do that without electronics? But anyways, you can describe it based on the physical properties of the system: springs, gears, circuits, electronics, right? Okay, cool. The design level. The second way I can predict the behavior of the clock is by saying, well, the clock was built. It was designed in order to tell time, right? So that I know that if I push this alarm button, that it is designed to go off at 6 o'clock in the morning, right? Because it says 6 o'clock. That's just what it was built to do, right? That's trying to use the design stance to predict the behavior of the clock. The intentional stance, the top level stance, is by attributing beliefs to the clock, right? So the clock believes it is currently 7:07. And that is why it is telling me it's 7:07, right? Or that the clock has a belief that it is a certain time, and it acts upon that belief by showing me the time and by telling me the time, all right? Now, that's absurd. We don't think clocks actually have beliefs. We don't think clocks actually have, desires, beliefs, goals, right? And so the clocks are made of physical things. They're made of wires, and they're made of circuits, and they're made of very inorganic things, right? Now let's take the clock, let's pick it up, move it to the side, and then we take, it's a weird idea, but we take a brain and set it in our lens, right? Those three levels can be used equally to describe how brains operate, right? The physical level might be used to describe, say, the threshold potentials of neuron membranes at, within the putamen, the left putamen, in individuals with Parkinson's disease. Usually it would be a post-mortem study because we can't get to those kinds of samples until then, or if there's some kind of serious brain tumor, right? Or if you have a rogue neurosurgeon, which seems pretty unlikely, right? So you can look at that, or even more simply, you can look at EMG activity in a muscle, which is something we oftentimes do in movement research. The design level would be such as to state that the brain, we predict the brain's behavior based on its design, right? So what designed the brain, Jonathan?
What designed the brain?
Yeah, you already mentioned it. It's a rhetorical question. I'll answer it, I guess. It's evolution, right?
Yeah.
Evolution designed the brain. Evolution designed every organism's brain. Interestingly, evolution also designed organisms that can move without a brain, such as sponges, which can move with the current of the water, attach to a rock. And when they attach to the rock, so first off, they actually have a nervous system when they're first generated. It's really primordial. But when they attach to the rock, they actually digest their nervous system for nutrition, right? So it shows that maybe nature doesn't care much about nervous systems, right?
Right.
And it's also been used as an unkind analogy for tenure in academia. So, that's the design stance. Things were designed to do something, right? The behavior of birds occurs because, or the feather color on this, golden warbler on my deck was designed such that the males are very easily visible to females, right? We talk about it being designed.
Right.
And then we have the intentional level. And this is a level that we talk about clinically, right? We talk about people having desires, having beliefs, right? Having pain beliefs, having emotions, fears. Fear avoidance is one. I'm in the ortho world, I'm talking about now. People, come in with histories, memories. They have, the way we predict their behavior in the clinic is by attributing these things to them because they're people and they have beliefs and they have desires and they have goals. And to fail to recognize that is a huge problem, right? If you treat your patient like a mass of neurons, right, you're going to lose your license really fast, first off, right? You might need to talk to somebody about that if you find yourself doing that. But that is actually the kind of problems that occur in empathy burnout, right? You stop being able to relate to people. Mm-hmm. You have difficulty seeing people and talking to people as if they're people. They're simply one more patient on the schedule. And I've got so many notes to do at the end of the day. And God, I just want to get through this, go through the motions, repetition. And it's serious, and particularly in nursing homes, it's oftentimes seen, right? Which is a really heavy neuro population. I'm sure you tell me more about that than I could tell you. But empathy burnout is largely a demonstration of a failure to work at the intentional level. So again, clinically in PT, right, to bring it back home to where it really matters, where the rubber hits the road, we adopt the intentional stance, right? We talk to people as if they're people because they're people, because they have beliefs, desires, goals, because we can manipulate beliefs, desires, and goals, right? I don't mean manipulate in a negative way. I mean, we can help people to realize things, particularly in the context of pain here, right? Yep. Again, in ortho context, we can help people to realize that, their nucleus pulposus is not going to eject from the posterior portion of their annulus fibrosus if they flex their spines more than 35 degrees, contrary to what your neurosurgeon may have suggested, right? Or it's what your spine surgeon may have suggested. So, and sometimes people really shouldn't flex their spines. Let me make that clear. But in general, fear is a consequence of words like that. And so we adopt this intentional stance to describe such problems. But there are some counter intuitive examples, which you can speak about in neuro, which make me question whether the intentional stance is the only stance we should adopt. For example, how do we think about ideomotor apraxia from that perspective? You know, how do beliefs and desires and goals play a role in somebody with ideomotor apraxia from a stroke, right?
Right.
So,
yeah, and I not to cut you off. Go ahead and finish, because I like where you're rolling. So,
no, I'd like you to interject here, because I want to hear your opinion on this. You're more of a neuro guy than I am in the clinic, John.
So let me preface this. I'm a new neuro guy in the clinic. Let's be clear about that. I think, kind of to get back to the point that I was using earlier, I think that, you know, with these movement conditions that are more perplexing from a neuroanatomical or a lesional perspective, it's kind of, and this is something I struggle with and that I'm trying to get better with, is because I learn and think very much in a very foundational way of, this is what the neuroanatomy is, these are what these structures do, and if I can understand the structures and the communication between the structures well enough, I should be able to design an intervention program and develop a hypothesis on movement before I even see the patient. And just to a large extent, that is relatively true. But I think when you start to get into these further conditions, and particularly with these, you know, these lesions, like a basal ganglion lesion with a corona radiata, and it's like you do your testing, and then your testing is like, well, I expected something to be impaired. I wasn't fully sure what, but I had a few ideas, and none of that on my testing was impaired, which, again, we're not going to get into the reliability of the testing. That brings up a whole other debate.
Yeah, let's table that.
But I think what it gets back into, like I was mentioning earlier, is just that making it salient, and realizing that I might not be able to impact that physical level. I might not be able to impact that design level, but I can impact that intention level through, and I'm kind of winging this here, through getting a better picture of the patient. Because, and this is kind of something based on my personal philosophy on rehab, is that, you know, our bodies are the best healers that out of anybody, and out of any of that, our brain is the starting and the ending point for that, because our brain controls everything that goes on within the body to some extent, or at least has the ability to control it. And, you know, and that's part of why the tagline or whatever for this channel is strong and intentional. I started using that with a patient I was working with, and they started liking it, and I was kind of like, that's the whole gamut right there, is make your movement, make your intention strong and really intentional with what you're trying to do, because then you're gonna, at least in my opinion, you're gonna position the brain to use its connections and understandings and contextual factors that we as a species don't have an understanding of, in a way that is going to impact their ability to rehab and progress more so than anything that I could do with them. And then what I do with them, for based on the maybe movement deficit or whatever deficit I'm seeing, is a adjunctive bonus on top of that. If that makes any sense. And I hope I didn't skirt around the question too much, but
no, that makes a lot of sense. The main mechanism of action of what we oftentimes do, in my very not so humble opinion, is, you know, described best at the intentional level, where you can affect people's goals and desires, and you can make lasting, impactful change in somebody's life by helping, and in an ortho context, their pain with movement. In a neuro context, their capacity to move, right? And this is where the meaning is. This is the meat of the matter, right? We help people move better, in your words, intentionally, right? Intention plays a big part in that, right?
Mhm.
Right. But where do we put certain interventions, right? So I'm going to question some things, and I'm going to bring it back to intentionality because because again, it really is all about intentionality. I promise. Disclaimer at the beginning, it really is. But I'm going to go down a level. I'm going to poke and prod you a little bit.
Yeah, go for it.
How do you describe deep brain stimulation in Parkinson's disease? How do you describe the efficacy of that? How do you describe the efficacy of L-DOPA and carbidopa interventions on people with Parkinson's disease, right? Mm-hmm. Well, we don't say that L-DOPA, the mechanism of L-DOPA is increased vigor, right? I wish we could find vigor, the physical chemical of vigor, put it in a pill and distribute it to people, because I think it would help a lot of people with neurologic issues, right? But we describe it in terms of physical processes, dopamine, right? Or deep brain stimulation we describe in terms of frequencies. By the way, we don't know how deep brain stimulation works yet.
Right.
The same can be said of metformin and diabetes and a lot of other problems, right? So it's not the case that we need to understand the physical mechanisms of an intervention in order for it to work, which is something I'd absolutely like to highlight, because I think it is improbable that we'll ever understand how exercise and movement acts as an intervention, right? It is just mind-bogglingly complex. But there is room for a physical interpretation for some of these things, right? And any change that we see in people's beliefs, desires, goals, right, capacity to move, it is always reflected by a change. It necessarily must be reflected by a change in the physical structure, the physical composition of their brains, right? Right?
Yep.
So how do we grapple with that as people who, first off, aren't trained to surgically implant deep brain stimulators, right? That aren't trained, we are trained to prescribe certain medications, but are not licensed to prescribe certain medications, right? And any medication, unless you're in the Army, right? Mm-hmm. How do we grapple with that, where we are movement experts, we use movement as an intervention, right? And we can impact the way that people move, and through that, their beliefs, their desires in life, their goals in life, such as, being able to lift their grandkids, or being able to stand up from a chair again, or being able to grasp a wine glass, right? Which is a real goal for a lot of patients with stroke, right? To grasp a wine glass. How do we reconcile this physical approach with this intentional approach, right? Mm-hmm. And that is the fundamental starting point for motor control, right? And describing how physical processes in the brain operate such that movement emerges, right? If you think about, well, you think a lot, so I'm not going to encourage you to think anymore, but sometimes I think about, the relationship between the things that we talk about that matter in physical therapy, right? Goals, we talk about impairments, activity limitations, and participation restrictions, right? And what those really are. I mean, that's largely an intentional description of these things, right? It's at a very high order level, but those are all different ways to talk about movement. And impairment is the inability to say, grasp a wine glass and maintain a grasp. That's an impairment, right? An activity limitation is the inability to grasp a wine glass, right? Such that you are no longer able to, or it could be any glass, such that you are no longer able to drink, right? And the participation restriction for that would be, you could list 100 of them, right? Difficulty going to restaurants, needing a caretaker in order to feed yourself, or requiring large amounts of physical therapy in order to use your contralateral limb in order to do the same task, right? There's so many different problems that emerge at higher levels from the simple inability of the motor regions in the brain to coordinate the grasping of a glass. Mm-hmm. Right? And that is reflected fundamentally at changes in the physical construction of the brain, right? So motor control starts and ends with movement. And the fundamental question, God, I have a lot of questions. Here's another question, one I've already brought up, is, okay, what is motor control?
Yeah.
Right? Because we know where to start, but not where to go. And the idea is that we describe movement as it happens in the world, right? And a really easy place to bring that to light is in the beginning of this talk we just watched, which is now over 2.5 hours ago, where Mark Latosh asked a question, what is such a thing as it was an intense question, wasn't it? It came out 5 minutes in the presentation. I love these debate clubs. It's great. So much action. But Dr. Latosh came out and asked, what is an intelligent machine? Right. And how does, what is an example of an unintelligent machine? And then he went on to elaborate on why a hammer can be considered an intelligent machine, which I think he's right in. But what he's doing is he's adopting a physical approach. He's adopting the physical stance towards the brain, and he's extrapolating from that physical stance onto the brain, right? If we view the brain as something that works in a way like a hammer, which it doesn't, it's way more complex, right? It's way cooler than a hammer. But if we look at how the brain operates, such as some other, quote unquote, inanimate object might operate, we might actually begin to predict and understand the changes that we want to see that have the greatest impact at the higher level, right? In order for us to truly impact somebody's capacity to hold a wine glass, right, it is necessary to understand exactly how it is possible to do so in the first place, right? And you can do so by saying things like your body has a model of the wine glass and of its hand, and a model of your body in external space, right? And you may even have an internal model somewhere in your brain that maps these things, right? Yet, how much, what's the right way to frame this? How much does an internal model weigh? Where is the center of gravity of an internal model, right? The questions don't make sense, right? Those questions only make sense for physical things, right? I could ask the same, what is the center of gravity of a belief? Doesn't make any sense, right? Okay, we're doing philosophy now, so let's back up, right? The idea is that internal models, if they exist, they're a higher order phenomenon, and they're not the kind of phenomenon that we really hope to understand in order to predictably manipulate things such as prehension, right? We need a normative account, a normal account of how these things happen in order to intervene on them in ways that really matter, right? And we can get it right without knowing that. And largely, I think the profession has done that and is doing that. We are getting it right without knowing mechanisms, right? What is it? The bark of the cinchona tree, I think it's a cinchona tree. There's a bark of a tree in South America that was used for generations to treat fever, right? And as it turns out, we learned that fever actually has a pathogenic cause. It's called malaria, and the tree bark has quinine in it, right? So this was used for generations and generations before anybody knew anything about malaria and anybody knew anything about quinine, right? Which happens to be an anti-malarial that's still used today, although less often than some newer brands, right? So we don't have to know how things operate at those levels in order to do things right. And I think that's where we're at as a profession right now. And we're operating at the intentional level in terms of beliefs, desires, and goals in order to manipulate movement. And I think that is where we have to be right now. And we have to put our resources until we have a better understanding of how things operate at the lower level, right? But, and this is pure philosophy at this point, right? But the question comes back to ideomotor apraxia. How do you think about somebody with ideomotor apraxia? How do you talk and think about somebody with Broca's aphasia, where they have a difficult time initiating language? It's more of a speech path issue than a PT issue per se, right? And how is that different than somebody who has fear avoidance for low back pain? Is one person more responsible for those impairments than the other person, right? Because somebody with empathy burnout may certainly think so, right? which happens often in ortho clinics. Until we have a description of some of these phenomena or some of these problems at the level of the brain, it becomes very easy to attribute the problems to the person, which may be a cause of empathy burnout, right? So I think largely the view that's adopted is not a wrong view, but should be more inclusive and open to things such as lower level physical descriptions of the brain that don't, implicate things such as internal models or even Bayesian predictions, right? Because we don't know if those things really happen in the brain just yet. They're useful fictions in a way. They're very useful fictions, right? So that's my spiel. But the problem with that spiel, besides it being almost an hour in length, is that it's not really clinically useful yet, right? And by that I mean we don't have a language of movement in order to talk about movement in consistent ways between patients, clinicians, specialties, and specialists, right? In order to even define our terms and what we're talking about, right? Even if we know that X part of the brain is associated with Y movement, and therefore we should do Z, that only makes sense if the guy next to me thinks that X, Y, and Z are the problem and not A, B, and C, right? So standardizing that language is really important, and that's why I brought up that really old Russian guy named Bernstein. Mm-hmm. There's a lot to be learned from folks that have been there before, right? So that was a lot all at once, right? Yeah. Do you what do you think about the clinical side of these things, Jonathan? My intuition is that the practicality of it at this point and the ideas aren't yet built up enough to be influential in clinical decision making, right?
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I think that was like a maybe a turning point for me this past week, because I know last week in one of my mentor sessions I was like, I don't feel like I flat out just said this to my mentor before our session. I was like, because we were talking about motor control, and I was like, I don't feel like I could give you a valid definition of motor control right now. And she was kind of like, well, I don't really think I could either, quite frankly. She's like, I have ideas, and she named a few other people within the program, and she's like, and we all have a different idea. And that didn't sit well with me. But then I think this week, just thinking about it more, and then, you and I briefly chatted before this, thinking about that and listening to the discussion earlier, and it made me more comfortable with that, just living with that. And I think part of that's living with that vulnerability of admitting that you don't know, and admitting that as a science culture, we don't really know yet. But I think clinically, because we don't know, it forces us to ask more questions, particularly when the patient's in front of us. Ask more questions to get a better understanding of what the patient's concept of what's going on and what their beliefs, and really taking it patient-centered, but I'm not going to dwell on that because we already kind of talked about it. But then also clinically using measures that are functionally based measures. So, we can reassess manual muscle testing. We can reassess proprioception testing or sensation testing or whatever until the cows come home. But if you don't assess, a timed up and go and a 5-time sit to stand or a Berg balance scale and see that functional change, you have no idea if what you're doing actually matters. And quite frankly, if your patient doesn't think it matters, it doesn't matter anyway. And so I think in terms of clinically, it's understanding that, yes, we have these concepts and we have these theories and we have these, maybe systematic reviews or CPGs or what have you that point towards interventions and thoughts and programs that are maybe more beneficial, but to also understand that maybe some of the language that's used more towards the background section of those articles kind of explaining some of the anatomy isn't necessarily fully understood either, in that your personal clinical interpretation of the patient and the patient's interpretation of their own body, it plays just as much of a factor into that. And you know, I always try to bring it back to, you know, the evidence-based practice tool is evidence, clinical expertise, and then the third one's the patient. And I think a lot of times as PTs, either you're not striving to be that expert clinician and you're not including that patient degree that you should, or you're not including that evidence base that you should, or you're really striving to be that expert clinician, and that's kind of maybe the piece that gets left out, is that patient piece, because we're so focused on what the evidence says, so focused on what we do know, and not as focused on, it doesn't matter what we do or don't know. What matters is what the patient wants, what the patient knows, and how we can use what we know to draw out what the patient may or may not even subconsciously know. You know, in the case of, you know, ideomotor apraxia, they can perform the task automatically, but they can't do it on command. Their brain knows that map. Their brain knows that process. But when it has to consciously think about it, it's not, there's a disconnect there. And I have no evidence to back that up, or my interpretation of ideomotor apraxia may be incorrect there, but and I think just taking that concept and applying it to a larger scope, our bodies and brains, yes, there's things that we as therapists and educated and evidence-based clinicians can do, but understanding that the patient's brains and neurology's ability to adapt, change, and overcome, and figure out that new task accomplishment is as, if not more powerful than any systematic review or anything that we can do. And that is what we don't understand at all.
Yeah, I would agree. It's all got to be task related. It's all got to be task related. And, you know, in the absence of the task thinking clinically, or in the absence of even task related research, you know, you're playing darts in the dark. You know, you don't know where the dartboard is. You don't know where you're throwing them. You know, so it's all got to be oriented towards some end goal.
Yeah.
And you know, the same is true for the brain. Mm-hmm. The questions you ask the brain. Oh, there's some neat things out there, but unless there's some task that you have that's in relationship to it, you don't really know what you're asking. You know. Yeah. That's a great way to think about it. And you know, I wish that motor control as a field of study had more to offer clinically, right, than it currently does. There are some clinical tidbits, right? There are some clinical pieces which are important. One of them, which is the concept of dynamical stability, mm-hmm. which I won't go too far into depth with, but it was the idea originated with Bernstein and Synergy. It's the capacity for stability. It's not at all obvious how, you know, there can be such a thing as an unchanging force produced by the body when you look at the brain during that unchanging force production with your fingers on the wine glass. It is just a storm of electrical activity. There is so much variability and so much going on in the brain. It is not at all obvious how it is possible for anything stable in the body to occur, right? Or even stable gaze. It is not at all obvious that, you know, I should be able to look at your nose through the online chat and turn my head and keep my eyes on your nose. By the way, when we have problems with the brain, that's one of the things that can go wrong, right? Gaze stability. So it's a higher order phenomenon, but stability is important. And the concept of synergy and stability will give us some insight into or it will help us create clinically meaningful insights into human movement, its pathology, and, you know, ways that clinicians can manipulate it predictably in ways that benefit patients, right? Because at the end of the day, that's what it's all about, right? At the end of the day, it's all got to be about clinical applicability, and the philosophy is fun, the science is fun, talking about brains and evolution and all that is fun. It's only as important insofar as it helps, clinicians make good decisions and helps patients get better.
Right.
And, oh, by the way, we should do another talk in evidence-based practice.
Oh yeah.
I'm conscious of you. I'm conscious of your time here. I don't want to take up too much more of it, but
bad I'm taking a lot of yours.
No, it's fine, Jonathan. I've got all night, really. I've got a whole bottle of red wine next to me that's untapped, but I fear that if I drink too much more, I'm going to be even more unhinged and start talking about things.
I mean, I think we've had a great conversation, and I know that, from viewing it in my perspective as somebody who is still grasping a lot of basic, clinical concepts and bringing them into my practice from an actual practice standpoint. I have more questions now than ever, and some of them are basic, and some of them are maybe this higher level that just because I have a tendency to ask questions. When I was a little kid, my parents I'd ask why all the time, so they would eventually just say that's the way God made it, because I know I couldn't ask another question.
That's where it ends. Yeah.
I agree. I think maybe we're going to have another chat sometime, but if you could give people that are watching or listening this, if you could give them one action step, just based on, doesn't even have to be about what we talked about today, just anything that you think people listening to this to make them a better therapist, make them a better person, anything that you think would be a good action step, doesn't necessarily have to relate today to what we talked about today. What would you give them?
Yeah, I think I can relate it to today. And I think a really important take-home message from any science of the brain and all the complexity that goes into it, all of the methods, all of the research, the big take-home is that everything that clinicians choose to do, or if you're a clinician listening, orient your treatment, every part of your treatment towards an explicitly formulated goal between you and the patient that is shared. Because it is not only, a goal that you have and a goal that the patient has, it is built physically into the structure and system of people's nervous systems. Mm-hmm. And, what you're working on has to be salient, and moreover, your actions, the more coordinated they are towards some final end, the more benefit you'll see from your interventions, hopefully in line with some research, but more so in line with what the patient in front of you is showing you, telling you as a person. Mm-hmm. So that's the one take home. If you ask me in 5 years, maybe it'll be different.
so make it salient. Could you maybe say make it strong and intentional?
I could say make it strong and intentional. That one, Jonathan.
All right. Well, I thank you, and I appreciate you coming on. And we'll have to talk to you soon. Have a good one.
Yeah, of course.